Okay. So sorry about that, everyone. Hello, it's me, ATARi HMB. Welcome everyone to the stream. We had a bit of a trouble because our device seemed to gotten disconnected. But without further ado, I'm glad to see that everyone else is here. Okay, so I just want to give a brief greeting to many of the followers who are here today. And that will include the list, as we could see. Sunny D, welcome. IDK, hello. Onyx, welcome, of course. And LeBron, always being there for the support. Keaton and Zay and Timothy, thank you guys so much for participating and coming to the stream today. Today, we're going to be talking about Powerscaling 101. And I'm doing this stream specifically because I believe it is better to do a stream with a lesson when I can have a live audience attending. That way, we can go ahead and have questions and common misconceptions asked and have a live base answer. And I believe that is the best way to engage with our audience. So without further ado, I do want to make one more statement. Within this stream, for this first segment, I want to say, depending on how long it will take me to go over the basics, there may be things I won't cover. And that's okay. That's why we have a Q&A. But I want to go over the bare bones basics and the importance of where they stand. And without that, I believe it's important for me to say that a lot of the Q&A questions that you hold off until after the lesson. The reason is because there will be confusion if you ask during the stream, and some may divert off topic. And I want to keep this very straightforward so that if people want to take clips of this and bring it to somebody else of little understanding, it'll make it a lot more straightforward and organized. It's a lot easier than doing a video format, as I don't have to do too much editing while doing this. You guys could sit back and be able to follow through. And any questions, we can go over them accordingly. But I'd ask that you save the questions for now, but still feel free to talk amongst yourselves within the chat or things you like to agree on openly. With that said, let's go ahead and begin the lesson. I will not be reading the chat currently until after we're done with the lesson. So let's begin. Powerscaling. Powerscaling is a tool that we use for understanding how strong, fast, or where does a fictional character lie. One of the things we need to learn with powerscaling is that powerscaling is going to be something that's going to run all over the place, depending on one particular person. The author. This is key because the author is going to be the ultimate dictator on what happens to his character. So one thing we need to know before we go into anything is powerscaling is dictated by the franchise or the character's author, and this can also be subsequently written as the writer. And outside of the writer, we have one more factor that comes into powerscaling. And this is what it is susceptible to. Understanding these two specifics is what's going to help you on your journey to powerscaling. I need to stress this because many of the up and coming powerscalers nowadays are so held on to this idea of objectivity. Now, objectivity is the goal, okay? It's the goal that we want to reach, but we must accept that all levels of powerscaling conclusions are most of the time going to be susceptible to change because of the author or writer. This may seem like it is very basic, but you'd be surprised at the amount of people who ignore this one step. I'm not joking. Now, outside of that, that is the bare bones basics. This is the disclaimer. This is what you need to expect in the realm of power scaling. Now, let's move on to one of the more meat and bones of power scaling: character specifics. So, if I have a character, specifically a character who's designed to have a subset of abilities, powers, even characters without abilities and powers, with more so just intelligence, there are a set of categories we need to look at. And I like to divide these categories into several components. First is powers and abilities. Now, powers and abilities, for example, is going to be something along the line of what a character is capable of. This could include many examples, such as shooting a projectile from his hand, in the sense of being able to have an attack that can be shot from far away. This can also include many other abilities, such as flight, where a character can fly. And this can even include levels of teleportation, which a character may look like a blur, and many other categories can go on. The list of powers and abilities is very important because it's the most universal and biggest characteristic of a character that makes them stand out. But we don't focus too much on the name. We focus on the ability and how does it behave. But then we go into our next category. That's important to understand. And I could go touch up on a little bit more about this, but this is such a big category that we don't want to get lost in the sauce. So let's move to the next. Next is AP and DC. AP is something we know as attack potency. Okay? So attack potency is the ability an attack has, the potency of how powerful something is. Whereas DC is a little bit more specific. It's the destructive capacity. Now, these two, I put them around the same category because they're essentially the same thing to a degree, as they record power. Striking strength can go into this category. Powers and abilities and many others. But what's the key difference is that with attack potency, you're really focusing on the joules of energy released. Whereas with the destructive capacity, you're really focusing on the AOE, which is also known as the area of effect. Now, obviously, this seems like I'm talking about very basic stuff, but follow along and we'll get into a little bit more of the other potential ports. Remember, we're just taking our first 2 bites right now. So let's enjoy it and chew it slowly. Attack potency records the joules of energy most of the time, but destructive capacity by its nature will already include that as well. So joules is included in destructive capacity. Okay? So I'll put plus J. Joules can also be noted as newtons, which can also translate over to watts, depending on what system you're using as a measurement, like gallons, pints, liters, etc. So the importance of AOE is when a character can remove a battlefield. We call this BFD or BFR, battlefield removal. Battlefield removal is important because it can dictate the overall result of a battle. A character who can blow away the entire battlefield is going to be able to do a lot of things that a character with a high level DC, AP AP may not. So you may have a character who can, have a very powerful attack, they're fighting planetary fighters, right? But this guy has the DC, which can also translate over as far as range as well, depending on what medium they're using. And that range or medium is going to be what allows for higher DC. This is important because certain characters don't have the means to have that level of DC. If we're talking about Monkey D. Luffy, he may not display the same DC as Don Chinjiao since he doesn't have a needle base, head. But he does have the AP, aka Jewels of Energy, that is required to replicate Chinjiao's feat. But since he's a rubber man and he's punching with, a fist instead of a needle head phenomena, this is why these categories are so important. So I hope that answers the basics of that. But it goes a lot further, and that's when we'll get into another category. So that is that category. The third one, which is important, is going to be speed. And speed is categorized into two categories. SC for combat speed and TS for travel speed. Basically, how fast a character can throw a series of punches, their abilities to throw out punches. It's going to be dictated by that, combat speed. Whereas travel speed will be based on how fast a character can travel. And these will differ a lot. It's like the saying goes, who's faster, Usain Bolt or Bruce Lee? So that is an important category that a lot of people seem to undermine the most of the time. So it's very important to understand that these do mean something. Moving forward, we have last two categories, which is going to be durability. Durability is important. Characters are not always going to output what they can, are not going to be always to take in what they can dish out. If somebody hit as hard as me, I don't think I'll be able to take that punch to the chin, So it goes for pretty much everyone else. You cannot always take in what you can dish out. It's very hard to make that assertion. Because you have parts of your body that are not designed to take certain damage. Durability is such a versatile thing. And so it's important to understand this. If Mike Tyson was to fight himself, he trained specifically to be able to tank his own attacks. Goku in the gravity chamber would purposely shoot a Kamehameha wave, right? Goku would purposely shoot a Kamehameha wave, and he would circle it around King Kai's planet or around the gravity room, and he would purposely tank it to test and increase his durability. We do the same thing in karate. If you've done Kyokushin karate, they will also do the same thing by training your durability, because what you can output is not always what you can take or handle. And this goes for every character pretty much. Now, there are some series such as Bleach and Dragon Ball where 9 times out of 10 characters can take in what they can dish out. And if not, sometimes even more. Have you seen how many times Ichigo's gotten cut? He's taken in more than he even could dish out. Grimmjow wasn't even fighting him fully, but Ichigo seems he could take more abuse than he can put out. So that's also something to factor in. I would also assert Naruto is no exception to this rule as well. But remember, Look, I'm not even spelling the word right. Durability. There we go. Durability is also an important category. And then the fifth and final category is what we just call extra. This can go from range to stamina to many other cases such as IQ, stamina, these are smaller subcategories. IQ is important. People say it's unquantifiable, but we can use IQ to dictate how a character has interacted in the situation, especially when we're talking about in-character fights, which I feel are the best fights to have. In-character fight of, for example, despite all of Itachi's abilities, in character, it's not very well. In character, he's very likely to start off getting you in a genjutsu because he's always on his guard. However, if we're doing an in-character fight of someone such as I gave an example before, Goku versus Superman, or let's say Dark Schneider, whereas Vegeta versus Dark Schneider, the two outcomes of both battles are going to be completely different. Watch Granola versus Goku and Vegeta. Vegeta doesn't get tagged. Goku gets tagged because he's trying to train while dealing with Granola, and it ends up almost killing him. So if Vegeta wasn't there, Goku could have very much died. You'd be surprised how often Goku can die in scenarios because he's always off guard, especially in Dragon Ball Super. But keep in mind, we can also use this to determine how characters interact with situations. Yujiro Hanma's ability to adapt and utilize his IQ, characters being able to look at other abilities and learn them, replicate them, or they're thinking outside the box. For example, if Yusuke had a mirror and he was fighting someone such as, Bartholomew Kuma from One Piece, a very powerful character, Yusuke may not know. Yusuke may shoot a spirit gun at Yusuke's IQ. He'd probably, let's give an example, shoot a spirit gun at, let's say this is Yusuke right here. Yusuke would probably know that he'll shoot a spirit gun, it'll get reflected by Kuma, right? So what Yusuke will do is Yusuke will fight Kuma, and, after seeing Kuma reflect the first one, Yusuke's IQ and battle IQ, we don't see Kuma Kuma wouldn't see this coming. But we know Yusuke's done this before. So Yusuke shoots a spirit gun, Kuma reflects it back, right? And then Yusuke would move out of the way, and there would be a mirror or something of the substance that could reflect his ray gun back, and it would just come back at Kuma, and Kuma may not see it coming and get tagged. That's an example of how you can quantify IQ. You can look at scenarios characters have been through, have done, and you can quantify them in different ways if you're doing an in-character battle. Well, that is the importance and the difference of these categories. Now, keep in mind, there are other topics we need to discuss. We go into the next topic over and we talk about, something that's very important. And this is going to be about, we'll wait a little bit on that. We're going to talk about the next category for characters and power scaling, which is going to be, this one. Now, I've talked about this several times, but I still feel the need to do so. You see, dimensional tiering is a very specific category. What should be noted is that it is not equal to string theory, okay? String theory, and it is not equal to bosonic theory, because the idea is dimensional tiering, and dimensional tiering is more so really going to float towards multiverse theory. But that's more so on the ideas that different fictions will generate different theories on the multiverse. Bleach has the Soul Society and the human world. Both of these are stated to be worlds/universes. We know this for a fact. They are individually, if I recall, separated from something they call a dangai, a different flow of time, very extremely thick time, a fabric. But the fact that the lore wants you to believe this goes to show you that Bleach has its own set of its own multiverse theory. Dragon Ball has a lower living world right here with another world that orbits it. But what's very interesting, what's going to be very interesting about this is that Dragon Ball also has bubble universe theory, universes that contain universes that contain universes, and how there's many different other universes that are parallel partners, such as Universe 7 and Universe 6 are parallel worlds to each other, essentially, and they exist and operate in an even larger domain that is smaller than a domain that's bigger. Yumineko kind of uses a similar case, but instead of using Yumineko, I'll use Marvel and DC, which utilizes the same theory, but mixes it up by going into a bit of string theory, which is correlated to multiverse theory. So if you haven't been following along, let me paint a easy to understand example. String theory or dimensional tierin's purpose now is a metric utilized to understand a character's power when a limit seems like it's been reached or can be surpassed. You can't surpass infinity, but you can have an infinity that's greater than the infinity below it. How does that work? So remember, the idea of infinity is it transcends numbers. Why is this important? Because the idea of dimensional tiering is we want to transcend a number. Dimensional tiering could really be called another category, some people like to call it, is cosmology tiering. Because essentially what you're doing is you're taking the complexity of a cosmology and stripping it down. But here's the thing. You need, when it comes to this, you need a standard. Art, for example, art. When somebody is painting something, it is very subjective, right? Is it good or is it bad? When somebody paints something, it's a question is it good or is it bad? Right? So we have to ask that to ourselves. What does it mean to have a standard? Well, a standard is going to differ from each system. The purpose of a standard is to make every other series follow a line of rules so they can be quantified. We take everything and we put it under a rule so we can have a way to quantify it or scale it. Because if we don't do that, we cannot categorize anything. If a character says they can destroy a multiverse that's full of infinite universes, how can we compare this to a character in DC who could destroy infinite universes, aka a multiverse, but a super multiverse with infinite multiverses? Well, this is certainly infinitely bigger than this, right? So the purpose of dimensional tiering is how we can get into greater categories. This would be known as multiverse level or multiverse plus, since it's infinite. And since these hold infinite multiverses, this would be called complex or megaversal. But the truth is, it can actually be called any name you want. Just depends on the website and what they call it. But the reason I'm bringing this up is because there will be certain verses that fit this category, but they still may label it as multiverse. Okay? And there are characters in series such as Bleach, for example, which will have a low multiverse structure, 2 universes at least, continuums. Bleach will have such an idea, right? But in Bleach, they may label it as just universe. But just because they label it as universe doesn't mean destroying this is equal to being universal, or rather, it'd be low multiversal. Now, for those of you who are confused and do want an explanation on this, I'll go ahead and give you an example definition. I will look up, as you can hear me typing, in the Noah Webster Dictionary, written in 1828. A good definition of the word universe says of Latin universitas, the collective name of heaven and earth and all things that belong to them, the whole system of created things. So as you can see, this is important because it leads into the next category of what the next point is. Now, dimensional tiering can, of course, get very convoluted as it continues to arise. But essentially, I will explain those tiers in just a moment. We have to first understand one more category, and that is this. I'll put it in big red letters. Context matters. Why does context matter? Let me use a non-power scaling definition to help people understand why context matters. So let's say if I was a person who doesn't like to read. Well, here's what I would do. Let's say if, for the sake of argumentation, let's use something out of scripture. Okay. Let's use the old 1611 King James Bible. I'm going to use this to give an example of what some individual atheists or other individual groups may use to take certain scripture out of context. You'll see why, and I'll correlate this back to power scaling. But context matters because, for example, if a man findeth a damsel that is a virgin, which is not betrothed, lay hold and lie with her, and they be found, then that man that laid with her shall be given unto the damsel's fathers. The premise is people will read this normally and assert that, if a man does the R word to a woman, he could just pay for it. They think this is supported. However, this is what leads into a lot of categories of what we know as suppressing the evidence. If you follow through this footnote, you'll see that says go to this particular chapter. It's because that book was written before this book. And to give you a context idea, it says in that book, here's the passage here, it literally reads, if a man entice a maid that is not betrothed and lie with her, he shall surely endow her to be his wife. In fact, what's funny is it even tells you to go back to the one we just came from. So these two are correlated, but that's why context matters. Because when you read the context, you end up finding out later on that if someone actually did do the R word a couple verses prior, they would actually be put to death. That's to give you a very small example. That's why context matters, no matter what topic it is. And I just used a biblical example because I feel it would matter regardless of the topic. If we're talking about scripture, power scaling, or anything, context matters. I think it's very important. And because of context matters, we need to be careful of one of the major mistakes that many people make when it comes to this terminology. This is something used in many fictions throughout all levels because it's a form of expression when a character bypasses this and this. It's usually equal to this, but people tend to think it is equal to this. Now, if you are new to power scaling, what is this? Well, now it has become more so a type of jargon that is thrown around aimlessly. But if you were originally there when it was first introduced, you would have known it is the highest pinnacle of powerscaling or multiverse theory. To give you an idea, if a three-dimensional universe was contained at a level of infinite space, then a manifold of this universe would be stretched out in a sense of a line. This is a timeline. It records all states of this 3D universe in every second portion of every point. But what happens if you allow this line, since that's what it is, to become into a cross-section of another line? Well, the two intersections create a probability plane. This typically allows it to make a plane, aka a flat surface, a plane. When you allow this plane to layer itself infinitely over and over, then it creates a space. One is known as the probability plane. One is known as a timeline, and one is known as a phase space. This is usually commonly found within M theory or Tegmark in some of his variants of multiverse theory. But the idea of this is that most fictions follow the idea of an infinite number of possibilities. So in other words, this is infinitely greater. 5D is infinitely greater than 4D. 4D holds infinite 3D portions all the way to the end of time and the beginning of time. Time is infinite. So by proxy, 4D is infinitely greater than 3D. And by proxy of having multiple timelines that can be expressed on an infinite level of lines to make the plane, 5D can fold in a different direction and be infinitely greater than 4D. 6D can be five infinite 5D layers laid on top to make a cube of sorts. So as a result, 6D is infinitely greater. What they do now is we introduce categories of 5D being multiverse. This is a very common trope and the most common before anything else beyond it. You will find this in series such as Yumi Neko. You will find this in series such as Mortal Kombat 11, Daizire, Tenchi Muyo, Dragon Ball Z, and, well, more so specifically Dragon Ball Super, according to Furutamase, even if we don't acknowledge the other multiverses within itself, and much, much, much more. This can include Xenoblade Chronicles, the Archie Sonic series, and even certain indications of Spawn. It doesn't end, DC and Marvel. Multiverse is typically considered to be the plethora of many infinite timelines or possibilities, aka also known as dimension. But dimension means to measure, so don't allow the word dimension to always confuse you. This goes back to what I was saying earlier about context matters. But outside of that, when you go to 6-dimensional, they just label it complex, multiversal, or mega multiversal, and then they'll go to giga, and they'll keep increasing the number. From giga to tera to exa to penta, etc. When you go to 7D, the pattern repeats. The same all the way up to even 1,000. But what happens when you hit an infinite number of dimensions? Well, we'll call this infinite D. Well, infinity transcends numbers. So whatever this category is, I'll tell you in just a moment. But it can be considered Hyperverse Plus. But I disagree with that. Because Hyperverse Plus, really, it should be its own category. It should just be called infinite multi. It should be actually called, infinite dimensional. it makes sense because no matter how many dimensions you transcend, an infinite dimensional being is perpetually transcending himself over and over and over. And same with the hypothetical multiverse. Now, to not confuse you, let's get rid of this page and clean it up. The outerversal term is more so a state of being, but essentially it is the highest pinnacle that is even transcendent beyond infinite dimensions. But another way people like to look at it is, what if there are multi-infinite dimensions? Well, then that could change things, and it could reach its own category, multiple infinite dimensions that are all separated. Well, they would all exist within this, an outerverse. An outerverse is not the same as a zero dimension, which is the state of non-existence. It doesn't exist because it's zero. But an outerverse is the idea that transcends beyond the true essence of time and space. It is the monolithical peak because nothing can transcend outerversal. The whole low, mid, and high outerversal are nothing more but just hierarchies to rank other individuals who's reached this level. But the reality of it is, this level is what bypasses all levels of AP and DC. Because even if you could destroy this many multiverses on this complex level, you would never even come to even a zero infinitesimal small amount of what an outerversal being really stands for. These beings exist on a level where they are not bounded by any level of attack potency, any level of range, or especially any level of time. Therefore, their speed, attack power, and much more are pretty much all irrelevant as long as you don't sit in their category. They are the essence of everything that everything can be. But the only thing holding them back is their powers and abilities. That is the ultimate determiner for the next tier that transcends them all. And that is boundless. Essentially, it's self-explanatory. There's no limit anymore. Essentially, nothing can get in your way. And any concept can literally be turned into your whim. Speaking of which, let's explore this final part before we answer questions. A concept is an idea. And now that you understand what an outerverse is, or people will call it verseless, depending on who you talk to, the idea is an outerverse is the true meaning of no space-time, or being beyond the concept, aka the idea of space-time. It is not the same as transcending space-time, okay? But, again, as I've stated before, remember the one category is that context matters. Anyway, with that said, I just wanted to give a bare basics understanding on why and how to power scale, specifically what it is and what we do, and what to look out for. Remember the disclaimer rules of thumb. Power scaling is going to be universally applicable to everything, but it also needs to have these in mind. This is the best way to avoid conflict and constant battering your head back and forth with individuals who may have a different viewpoint than you. Just like art, you can't expect everyone to be on the same page as you, because not everyone is going to read it the same way. Understand this and have fun with power scaling. Thank you for watching. Now, everyone, I hope you guys enjoyed that. I'm now ready to start taking on live Q&As in relation to this. We have about 20 to 30 minutes left, depending on what we're getting. So I'm going to go ahead and change the screen color So we can go ahead and dissect into a bit more of a deeper category. So let's go ahead and give us a nice green screen, and that will allow me to utilize some chalk, like we're in a class. So let's go ahead and answer some questions that people may have. And once again, thank you everyone who participated. Okay, so we have a question from IDK output. I don't know what to put. I'm going to present your question on the screen. Let's go ahead and read it to everyone. What about Platonic concepts, ATARi? So to answer your question, we have to understand the definition of Platonic. Now, I'm going to keep this as very bare bones basic as possible. But a Platonic concept is essentially the perfect form of an idea. But keep in mind, an idea is a very abstract topic. In every Platonic concept, that doesn't always apply. For example, is a Platonic concept going to always, as most people assert, equal universal? Well, surprisingly, the answer is no. Why will it not equal universal? Well, it comes down to what a Platonic concept is and how many concepts exist. Not all concepts will constitute in that category. The Platonic concept of death exists in all ideas because the perfect form of death is to cease life. But is it possible to exist and have no life? Well, yes. So the question asked, does death truly transcend all forms? Well, yes, it does. Why does death, considered a Platonic concept, or the concept of death, why does it transcend to those realms? Well, because a being that can be alive in a realm, if I have a being who is infinite dimensional and they're alive, well, if they cease to be alive, they are now dead. That means death can be applicable to all levels that go higher and higher and higher. Erasure, existence erasure, also counts as a major semi subcategory of death, as it erases you out of existence. It is not the same as death, but because your life ceased to exist, it technically would still count as death. But what about other Platonic concepts? Well, the Platonic concept of time, how does that work? Well, will time always be everywhere? That's the curious question. Well, what do you use to measure time? That is the ultimate question. What is it like to not be bounded by time? We don't know. And because we don't know, quantifying such an idea is very difficult. Is the Platonic concept of time truly of this level? It's hard to say, because in reality, an outerverse transcends time. It's beyond time. So, maybe time as a Platonic concept may not transcend universal or even be universal, because the idea is an universal being transcends the very concept itself. Thus, they don't abide by the rules of true time. An universal being doesn't wait for something to happen, nor do they operate under something or the premise. There is no space, So, because space doesn't exist, they don't need to go from point A to point B. Where they need to be happens. But is time a infinite dimensional Platonic concept? I would say yes. But is it universal? I would say no. But I would still, at the same time, say yes. Because the idea is that it does take time to think or act. But as an universal being, a true universal being, there is no time to think because all your thoughts are perfect because they have all happened. There is no essence for anything to happen or take time. So, are all Platonic concepts universal? No. But can a lot of them be applicable to higher dimensions? Yes, because we are using these concepts to write a story. But the true reality of it, we don't really understand if there are newer concepts beyond our understanding in this world that a higher being, such as God, the Most High, has created. But again, that's why we limit what we can quantify in these fictional battles. So without that, there's really no other way to answer any further on that. I hope that answers your question, my friend. Thank you. Let's go to our next question. We have a question from JKSCP 106. The question says, did Daizenshuu 4 statement about heaven transcending get retcon after Daizenshuu 7 came out? Well, to answer your question, let's first examine the facts. Well, I would like to say no. The reason I want to say no is because we still have a book written in 1998, though American and based on the idea of Funimation, Dragon Ball interpretation, it's still borrowed from the source material and was based solely on the Daizenshuu in certain regards. So as a result, I cannot agree that this means that Daizenshuu 4 was truly retcon. If anything, Daizenshuu 4 was reinforced by Daizenshuu 7 and gave more concrete statements to help understand all of Dragon Ball. So nothing about any of this information would suggest a retcon, which is essentially to remove or overwrite a previous statement or verse. Hope that answers your question. We have another question from Timothy Mulema. Let's go ahead and look at that question. Timothy Mulema asks, how can you tell when a high-level feat is an outlier? Well, two ways. Number one, consistency. Or I should say three ways. Consistency. Number two, lore. Doesn't matter how much you think is an outlier. If the lore implicates anything related to it, then it should count. And last but not least, number three, which is going to be the overall feat itself. The feat itself. Is there any consistency through statements? Does the lore kind of support it? And what about the feat? What is the feat? We have to examine that in the character who's doing it. We have to also look at context. Context is going to give us clues on understanding when a feat is generally an outlier or it may just be an extreme high-end or rare occasion. For example, the lady who's the car that fell on the lady's child. When that lady lifted her entire car off from her child, did we think that this is simply an outlier? She can't replicate it again. Well, yes and no. Sure, it is, But who's to say circumstances will not call for her to do this again if the right conditions are met? In stories, we don't get repeated conditions too often, at least for the most part. So to say that this would be an outlier is hard to really say. You can also still use it as a re-replicated feat for a high end to say this is the highest highlight. And if the circumstances replicate anything similar, then we can use it. Otherwise, I wouldn't see a reason to do so. Hope that answers your question, Timothy Mulema. Okay. All right. Could you go into detail about conceptual manipulation? Well, Kuroshiki, I could, and we're going to bring that up. Kuroshiki asked, could you go into detail about conceptual manipulation? Well, let's go into a basic understanding of conceptual manipulation, but I won't go too deep. I'll tell you why later. Conceptual manipulation is the idea to control and manipulate ideas. Idea manipulation is something that has tiers. You can manipulate the laws of physics in a three-dimensional universe. Law is very important to understand. But what is law? Well, law is a dictation of the ordinal balance outside of chaos, a dictation of rules to establish the level of power or the state of a subject. So, because the three-dimensional laws of physics are not going to be as versatile as a four-dimensional law of physics, we cannot say that manipulating them is going to be equal. This is why, in typical cases, a higher dimensional being, let's say death, for example, is not going to be anywhere near affected by another being below them who can, let's say, manipulate death and keep everyone alive in the universe. Death can overwrite that rule. So then you might ask, did they truly overcome the manipulation of death? Well, yes, they did, but somebody of a higher authority, which is key, can also manipulate theirs. And there even is a possibility that there could be an even higher death. So depending on that can literally change the entire notion of all things, depending on how the story is written. So with that said, higher conceptual manipulation does exist, and it will change depending on the law. Every law is going to dictate a different set of rules, and every rules, depending on the fiction, is going to allow different subsets to be met. Certain powers may be nullified to certain characters with more ability just because of the way the laws of their versus physics work. And as a result, we cannot assert that every character who manipulates some level of concept is this outerversal being or something crazy. I hope this answers your question. Kuroshiki. No problem, JKS, SCP. The Infinity Gauntlet. Let's see. ATARi. When a being has little explanations, how do we scale them? That's a good question, Shadow Nightmare. Well, let's go over it. When a being has little explanation, how do we scale them? Well, we use two things. We use our lore, and we also use our brains. Our brains. We use the lore, our brains, which more so creativity. And we also use etymology. Etymology will have its uses here and there to kind of give us an understanding of exactly what a character is explaining or what they're doing. But sometimes No matter how much you do it, it may just be that the author doesn't even know what he's talking about. And as a result, because of that, bad writing could literally limit a character's ability. And as a result, we have to really use the lore of the series, our brains, to really break it down through creative thinking and get creative on how we can power scale them. And etymology, breaking down words and what their meanings are, can give a really good idea of what a character should scale to in most cases, like when we hear the term orders of magnitude from the Yu Yu Hakusho Viz translation. I hope that answers your question. Can a being transcending time be affected by any type of time manipulation? According to Tenjani. I like this question. Very good idea. Good question. Tehani asks, can a being transcending time be affected by any type of time manipulation? Also, can someone transcending time still exist in multiple timelines? Is the answer verse dependent? Well, let's answer the first part. Can any being transcending time be affected by any type of time manipulation? Yes. To answer that is because it depends on who is in control. Jiren the Grey doesn't have any time manipulation abilities in Dragon Ball. All we know is he's big, beefy, and muscular, but he has no time manipulation. Hit does, but Jiren is so strong that time, at least coming from Hit's manipulation, doesn't mean anything to him. We could tell this because though time manipulation doesn't work on him, what happens if this guy, and I'm sure we all recognize who this is, if this little angel decided to use a temporal do-over, could he do it? I'm pretty sure he can. As there are different levels of time and different temporalities that transcend prior temporalities. Temporality is a relationship to time. For those of you who may have been in the last stream and may disagree that temporality is not pertaining to the change of subsets or subjects and events, let's go ahead and bring out the second definition to Noah Webster, which is about 120 years before string theory was even an idea. 100 years before string theory was an idea, the term temporality, which is literally tempus, which means time in Latin or Greek, Latin, measured or limited by time or by this life or this state of things, having limited existence, opposed to eternal. Temporality is not eternal, as eternal is outside of time, with no beginning or end. It can be notated as infinite, or it could be notated as beyond space-time. This is why, when they say you'll live for an eternity, they mean you'll live not bounded by time, without no beginning or end, is what they mean. Overall, can someone transcending time exist in multiple timelines? Well, maybe not. You don't need to exist in multiple timelines to transcend time. Time is not something that always is manipulatable. Time, as itself, is something that's just an idea or a concept that we understand of the events that pass by within our world. It's self-evident that it exists, but we have no other way of measuring it besides assigning arbitrary numbers to moments that pass by in order for us to keep up with particular events. This is why time changes for everyone. Time is dependent on many factors, but as a result, a timeline in this case is not going to, despite if it goes to the future infinitely or the past infinitely, is not going to be subjected to allowing one person who could walk outside of it to be able to move all over the infinite space of a fifth dimensional construct. Keep in mind, a true 5D construct is not equal to infinite timelines alone, as it's a little bit more complicated. 5D is a terminology we use to measure multiverses not actual string or spatial temporal complexities on a real life basis, as temporality and being beyond temporality of transcendation is a lot more difficult to truly understand the essence of. But anyway, I hope that answers your question. We have we have a little bit more time to answer a few more questions. Let's still begin. Abdi Aklak ask a question. Do you think base Goku could be scaled to 9th dimensional? Well, considering you're talking about 9th dimensional in the sense of multiverse scaling hierarchies and not 9th dimensional as in a 9th dimensional being, well, that question all depends on the cosmology. So, do I think he could be scaled? Yes, I do. I do think he can. But do I think that is practical? Well, maybe. Maybe I do. But the whole premise is you can do it. And that was your question. So you can do that. You can. But is it practical? Depends on which version of Goku. Because each version is completely different in the way they are scaled. Because each Goku has a different subset of feats. Hope that answers your question. Let me see. Well, IDK What to Put says, ATARi, some people claim controlling the concept of mathematics is universal. Do you agree? That's my answer. Why? Yes, because mathematics is a concept and a gift given to mankind to measure. Dimensionality. Dimension is measure. Okay? So, without math, what can you use to measure? If you can get rid of the idea of measuring, then dimensionality allows for that. But it's also no. But why is it no? Well, I'll tell you why. Because when you get to this monster right here, math breaks. A lot of things start to become paradoxes that can't be answered and can't even have a consistent answer. So depending on the degree of how they transcend or how they use mathematics concepts or have the concept of mathematics will depend on the answer to that degree. Because it could be math correlated to the three-dimensional universe or math on a higher level that can account for different levels of different spatial directions, such as even ninth dimensional manifolds and objects that can go and bend in space into so many different directions that can't be perceived by a normal being. So a normal being has no way to actually understand that. So that's why the answer is yes or no, because it depends solely on the context of where that being is manipulating mathematics. Okay? Because if I had a mathematical manipulation and I could say, well, I want Goku's multiplier to be 30, that's broken. But then you have to ask yourself, Am I at the same dimensional tier to allow that? Because Dragon Ball's mathematics don't make sense. I mean, finite numbers and finite multipliers grant infinite transcending feats and outputs. So it doesn't make any sense. Same thing. Ichigo doesn't have an infinite multiplier canonically, but he has abilities to deal with things that can scale to some level of infinity on a high-end basis if you assert the Soul King is really low multiversal. A low multiversal structure contains elements of infinity, and those elements cannot be manipulated by a lower mathematical being because they're dealing with infinity. How do you break it? Can't divide it unless you divide it by 0. But then, how many times does 0 go into infinity? Well, the answer would still be infinity, because the point is, even if you divided 0 by infinity, well, the decimal would just become infinitesimal. You see, it's not that 0 can't be quantified, or when they say not quantifiable or error. It's just that the true answer can give you things that break math. If I do 10 divided by 0, how many times does 0 go into 10? 0. Okay. How many times does 0 go into this? Again, 0. Okay. Well, can I do 0 into 1? No, you can't, because you can't divide into these individual numbers. Well, okay, that's 0. Our value is 10. And so the point is, it will continue to remain 0 and continuously go on. But there are other cases where it doesn't work like that. Sometimes you can't even multiply by that number. Even if you try to multiply. 0. 0 to 1. 0. The point still stands. In division, there's a very hard explanation that when a certain number such as 0 is divided by 10, well, how many times does 10 go into 0? Well, would it just be 10? No, because 0 is such a small number. Okay, so what the hell is the answer? Well, the answer is, well, I can't go into this number. And no matter what, because it's such a small number, there's no way to really get 10 down to a point where it can be put into 0. So it just crashes math, because it's like, well, no matter how many zeros you keep adding, it'll never reach that point. You could be adding zeros infinitely, and you'll never get an answer or a product. So that's why the explanation, what I've noticed as a pattern under mathematics, is 0 always breaks mathematics. And I hope that answers your question overall. Well, that's a good question. I'm going to let this be one of the last questions, and then we're going to go ahead and end stream. There is a lot to do today. But overall, I want to thank many people who've come through. ATARi, in real life, doesn't a different universe mean different physics? It doesn't have to be, but that's what I've heard. So isn't it only universal? Well, different physics can literally transform everything you've known. Now, normally, it could just still be categorized as universal. But because we have a standard, right? We have a set of rules. The quantification of whatever this scales to could literally break the standard. You can have a universe that's infinite in size, and the laws of physics there, gravity pushes out. So how do you work with that? You can have it so that vectors such as up, left, right, and down, there is none. You can only move in diagonals on a grid locked in the universe. And as a result, three-dimensional space doesn't even operate in the same way it would in our universe. So because of these physical changes, the quantifying of such a complicated universal structure could literally not even be calculable under our normal standards. Hence why it just gets rid of them and ignores them. This is why certain characters are always non-quantifiable, no matter what. Saying that characters such as Accelerator can remove vectors and control them doesn't tell us much. Well, vectors are direction. Well, that may be so, but can he remove infinite vectors? We don't know if he can. It would be a no limits fallacy. But can he? Well, different physics. In Marvel, the Dark Universe sits as a 6.22 etc. type of dimensional plane. Keep in mind, it transcends the fourth dimension as stated in the actual statements. So that's a good scaling for the Incredible Hulk who threatened it. But it also doesn't have any electrons. So certain atomic structures and gravity don't even work the same. And as a result, this makes things very complicated. You cannot use electricity or any form of electrical current because, guess what? Electrons don't exist. So a negatively charged particle, such as an electron used in most levels of electronics, don't exist. So as a result, certain points of radiation may be completely structured differently. There may be different periodic table of elements, which I'm pretty sure there are. And as a result, there might be different ways vacuums behave because of this phenomena. And as a result, because vacuums may behave differently, and destruction and explosions may not even happen outwardly, like in our universe, like an explosion that goes outward, but explosions may just cave inward into a finite imploding part, implosions, or they may not even go inside, and they may not even go outside. They may neutral. There could be a universe where destruction is neutralized, and certain levels of AP can't get rid of it. So with that said, Accelerator can't do crap in certain universes, depending on if certain universes are abstract and don't have vectors. For example, a timeline necessarily has a it has a vector of the past, present, and future in a sense that they go forward and back. But the actual essence of time itself that exists, it doesn't really have a shape. The 3D object, aka the universe, is a shape that it manifolds, but the temporality of time itself, Accelerator can't control that. And there are dimensions in DC, even in Dragon Ball, that hold not only dimensionality, but temporality. Could he manipulate that? That's where we start to run into a lot of confusion when it comes to that question. But I hope that answers your question, Super Saiyan Rainbow 2. Anyway, guys, I would love to answer a plethora of more questions, and I hope to catch you on another stream where we could do more levels of Q&As, and I'll be able to go into more details. Be sure to follow the link in the description below, and we can even talk about a couple of these questions on the Discord if you guys are interested. Again, remember, those who join the Discord are all welcome, but remember to be kind. We practice kindness and a level-headed thinking, not this big boy energy that we're better than everyone and levels of arrogance. I hope you guys enjoyed this stream. It may not have been as hype as the last one, and you may hear I'm talking with a more serious and professionally controlled tone, but overall, as a result, I'm doing this because I want to be a little more serious on this topic. But thank you guys so much for watching. This has been ATARi HMB. Love you guys. Have a great day. I'm signing off. Peace.